right, thank you, everybody, and welcome to the Citroen Center panel, the 2020 Census and the Future of America. The Citroen Center was created through gifts of friends, colleagues, former students, and family to honor the career and legacy of Professor Jack Citroen. Purpose of the center is to advance knowledge of public opinion and political culture, both nationally and internationally, through reporting and advancing cutting-edge research through lectures and conferences, as well as original polling and research grants. The Citroen Center has events throughout the year, including the Citroen Award Lecture, which we had recently for Diana Mutz. If you haven't signed up for our email list, please go to the website and join the email list, as we'll have more events in the spring as well. So I have an incredibly distinguished panel to introduce today, so much so that it took me a while to edit down everybody's biographies to something manageable. And I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists in the order they're going to present. And then each one will present for somewhere around 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function. As questions occur to you, put them up there for panelists. We'll get to see them, and then after the presentations are over, I'll ask them of the panelists. So we are going to start today with Jennifer Hochschild, who is the Henry Labar Jane Professor of Government at Harvard University, where she also holds numerous other professorships. She studies and teaches about the intersection of American politics and political philosophy, particularly in the areas of race, ethnicity, and immigration, as well as educational and social welfare policies. She also works on issues in public opinion, political culture, and American political thought, and is currently conducting research on the politics and ideology of genomic science, immigration, political incorporation, and citizens' use of factual information in decision-making. Professor Hochschild is the co-author of numerous books, including Do Facts Matter? Information and Misinformation in American Politics, Creating a New Racial Order, How Immigration, Multiracialism, Genomics, and the Young Can Remake America, Bringing Outsiders In, Transatlantic Perspectives on Immigrant Political Incorporation, and The American Dream and Public Schools. Professor Hochschild was a founding editor of Perspectives on Politics, a prestigious journal published by the American Political Science Association. She was co-editor of the Political Science Review for multiple years. She's a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Science and a former member and vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Russell Sage Foundation. Our next panelist is Richard Alba, who's a distinguished professor at CUNY Graduate School. He's devoted his scholarly career to understanding the impacts of immigration on the groups involved and on the societies that receive them. Professor Alba has written and edited 13 books and published more than 150 journal articles and book chapters, and is a member of the American Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. Is the author or co-author of Italian Americans into the Twilight of Ethnicity, Ethnic Identity, the Transformation of White America, Remaking the Mainstream, Assimilation and Contemporary Immigration, Blurring the Color Line, The Chance for a More Integrated America, and more recently, Strangers No More, Immigration and the Challenge of Integration in North America and Western Europe, and The Great Demographic Illusion, Majority Minority, and the Expanding Mainstream America. Next up as our panelist is Rodney Hero, who is the Raul Izaguirre, I hope I pronounced that right, Rodney, chair in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. His research and teaching focus on American democracy and politics, especially as viewed through the analytical lens of Latino politics, race and ethnic politics, state and urban politics, and federalism. His book, Latinos and the U.S. Political System, Two-Tiered Pluralism, received the American Political Science Association's Ralph Bunche Award. He also authored Faces of Inequality, Social Diversity in American Politics, which was selected for APSA's Woodrow Wilson Award. And he authored Racial Diversity and Social Capital, Equality in the Community of America. He is also co-author of Multi-Ethnic Moments, The Politics of Urban Education Reform, Newcomers, Insiders, and Outsiders, Immigrant and American Racial Politics in the Early 20th Century, and Latino Lives in America, Making It Home. Finally, our last panelist is Karthick Ramakrishnan, who is professor of public policy at the University of California, Riverside, and serves as the executive director of California 100, a transformative statewide initiative focused on building a shared vision and strategy for California's next century that is innovative, sustainable, and equitable. Karthick founded the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside, and AAPI, a national publisher of demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. He has published many articles and 7 books, including most recently Citizenship Reimagined and Framing Immigrants, and has written dozens of op-eds and has appeared in nearly 3,000 news stories. Karthick was named to the Frederick Douglass 200 and is currently working on projects related to racial equity in philanthropy and regional development. He holds a BA in International Relations from Brown University and a PhD in politics from Princeton. All right, so now I will turn it over to Jennifer, who will present first, and then we'll work our way through the panelists.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. It's hard to imagine a more important topic than the census and the future of America, and it's hard to imagine a more significant and just enjoyable set of panelists to talk with. And so, Tax Citron, I want to thank you and the Citron Center for this invitation, this opportunity. I'm going to talk about what this really is a few minutes of a kind of prolegomena to an analysis. I haven't actually done the analysis, but I'm trying to set up a set of questions that I would love us to talk about collectively, and that I think is going to play out one way or another over the next few years. So it's the way in which the census gives us illumination into the intersection of generations, race or race and ethnicity broadly defined, and politics, meaning predominantly electoral politics. So next slide, please. I'm starting with all of these images that I'm about to show you are not mine. They've all come from authorities who have been using census material, but not from the Census Bureau itself and not from my own analyses. I'm told before this conversation started that this one is a mistake. So we'll find out later over the next hour or so why you maybe shouldn't pay attention to this. But nonetheless, this is a image that the Census Bureau itself is putting out with using Census's own understanding and own interpretation of its own data, basically showing that the non-Hispanic white population is declining in its share of population growth. And that's, of course, the little orange bar on the far right. And that's a continuation of a trend over many years, but is the first time that it's below 0, if we believe the census data and its definitions and accounting is correct. Okay, next slide, please. There's some ways of thinking about why. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just kind of want, as a setup for the broader conversation, it's important to think about, if this number is correct, why it's occurring and where it's occurring in the United States, because geography turns out to be a really important part of this story. So on balance, the white population, the non-Hispanic white population, has lower fertility than non-Anglo populations. That's been the case for many years. Fertility has been declining across various groups, but it's even lower among the white population. Perhaps in the most immediate past, because of the economic slowdown of the 2010s, immigration has, white immigration is very low, and immigration in general has been lower. So the population as a whole has been declining, but white immigration even more than immigration from other countries. The white population is aging. There are a higher proportion of the elderly died of COVID-19 than of any other age group, and the elderly population are disproportionately white. So in that sense, it was a bigger impact, not proportionally, but in absolute terms. And a rise in the set of children who are identified themselves or identified by their parents or by the person who fills out the census for them as not being white only, because they are racially mixed. And so the census classifies them as being multiracial rather than white. Where is this happening? Well, basically across the United States. Again, if you believe census data, 35 out of the 50 states had population losses in the non-Hispanic white category. And all but 3 of these actually had population gains in the other than non-Hispanic white populations, the non-Anglo populations. The white population, again, using the census numbers, has declined in about 2,500 out of the 3,100 counties. So basically largely across the United States. And most of these counties, again, not a majority, although not close to all of them, had gains in the non-Hispanic population. So it's happening for a bunch of essentially demographic reasons, and it's happening largely across the United States, in most states and most counties. Next slide, please. This is another way of showing the same. This is a comparison of the non-Hispanic white population, which according to the census has had a 5 million person decline. And the other population groups have increased. So Latino or Hispanic especially. This is again from 2010 to 2020, according to the census categories. The population of people who identify as mixed race or multiracial, 2 or more races, Asian American, Black slightly, other races, which is largely Native American, Alaska Native, Pacific Islander. I guess not Pacific Islander is a separate category. So basically the point here is that other populations are growing, and by the census categories, the white population is declining. That's really the big point to take away from this image. Next, please. So if we think we need to think in terms of states. If we think in terms of in political categories, and clearly states matter a lot, partly because states themselves are diverging in partisanship and public policies associated with partisanship enormously over certainly the last 5 years, maybe longer than that, and partly because the demography is looking different in these different states. So on the left side of the states that have a population gains in one or another of these categories, Florida is growing in both the white and Black and Latinx populations. Texas is growing in all 4 populations. New York, California and New York are similar in the sense that they are increasing in their Latinx and Asian American population. They are losing proportionally, or in absolute terms, white and Black population. So again, there's a set of states, but there's sort of 4 or 5 that seem to be leading the pattern in one direction or another. Next slide. So what all this adds up to, if we believe the census numbers, is that the share of the population who are non-Hispanic white has been declining quite dramatically since 1980, gone from about 80% down to less than 60%. The share of the population that's Latinx, Latino or Hispanic has been correspondingly increasing. The share of the Black population is more or less the same. The share of the 2 or more races, American Indian, Asian American, is increasing, but from very small, tiny percentages to still what remain very small percentages. So the big story here is, according to the census, the decline in the white population and the rise in the Latino population. Okay, next slide. What I want to focus on, since I said my title was kind of generations, race, and politics, is to focus on the younger generation, starting with the under 18s and then rising to kind of voting age younger populations. And this is basically the same image that you saw a while ago, but focused only on the under age 18 population, and showing an even more dramatic decline in the share of whites and increase in the share of either 2 or more races or Latinx or Hispanic. So if you think about children, basically the younger than 18, it's the same dynamic that's happening for the country as a whole, but even more. Next slide, please. And again, you see the same thing. This is the same image that you saw a few minutes ago, but now for only the population under age 18, declined from about 70% white in 1990 to less than 50% white in 2020. So you saw a couple of years ago, big newspaper headlines about the birth rate, for the first time in American history, the number of children being born is of non-whites is greater than the number of children being born who are non-Hispanic white, and so on. So this is basically a visual image of that phenomenon for the full population under 18. And again, the Latino population growth is the most dramatic. The white population decline is dramatic, and the Latino population growth from about 12% to about 26%, so more than doubling over this period for the under 18 population. So there's a demographic transformation going on for the country as a whole, and it's especially prominent in children, which means, of course, that they're going to work their way through the age categories as we go through the next decade or two. Okay, next slide, please. Again, if we think about where the less than 18 age population are living, there's a very striking pattern. So the states which have 40% or more children who are not white are essentially every coastal state. You go all the way around. This does not include Alaska and Hawaii, by the way. But setting them aside, every single coastal state except very northern New England has a relatively large share of non-Anglo under 18s. If you look at the set of states that have a relatively small, which is less than 40% of their children under 18 being non-Anglo, it's essentially almost all of the interior states. There's a few exceptions, Nevada, Colorado, Arkansas, Illinois, Oklahoma. But if you look at a map, it basically looks like a sort of a curvilinear stripe across down the west, across the south, and up the northeast. And the entire center of the country is relatively fewer non-Anglo youth. So there's a very striking regional as well as state level disparity or differences going on here. Okay, next slide, please. I want to turn now to the implications of these results for politics, because I'm, after all, a political scientist. And there's two big takeaway points. One, again, if you assume that these data are correct, then you see on the left-hand slide, this is an image from the Pew Foundation, that nearly half of Biden's voters were younger than age 50. That's considerably higher than the proportion of Trump voters under age 50, who were about 40%. So it hasn't been, the Democratic vote share of relatively young voters has not increased over the past 4 years, in 2016, 18, and 20, but it has been and continues to be considerably higher than the Republican vote share of people under age 50. The image on the right is simply a graph showing the Biden vote in 2020 for people of a given combination of ages. So under 30 years old, about 60% voted for Biden. By the time you get to 50 years old and above, about 45% voted for Biden. So it's a big dramatic change from a substantial majority to a considerable minority, depending on age. This is for the entire set of voters. It's not racially separated. Next slide, please. This is a set of results that probably everybody knows. So I'll just remind you of what they are. That basically the non-Hispanic white share of the population is smaller than its share of the voters, and a substantial minority of non-Hispanic whites voted for Biden. The non-Hispanic Black population is roughly equal to its share of the voters, and they were overwhelmingly Democratic. The Hispanic population, only about half voted in 2020, compared with their share of the American population. This, of course, has to do with the fact that many people are undocumented or documented, but not naturalized immigrants. So this is not the voting eligible population. This is the population as a whole. And, 60% voted for Biden, but it's certainly not overwhelming compared to the African-American population. Asian Americans, again, a small share of the vote, of the small share of the population, a slightly smaller share of voters, again, for reasons having to do with immigration, not having been naturalized or registered or mobilized by the political parties, and a substantial share voted for Biden. So these are figures that we all know. I just wanted to bring them back into the picture because I was mostly talking about age. Okay, the last couple slides are where all of this is leading to. So the next image, if you can just keep clicking down so that we can get all of the, I said I couldn't find any data when I sent these in, and then I immediately found a little bit of data about the combination of race or ethnicity plus age plus 2020 vote, because that's really, it's that intersection is really what I'm trying to get all of us focused on. So we've seen results by age, we've seen results by age in relationship to geography, we've seen results by race, and so now what I want to do is combine them. The results meaning voting results. What I would love to do is look at this across individual states, because as we know from electoral politics, some states matter a whole lot more in determining the presidential outcome than other states do, but I don't have those data and I didn't do the analyses myself. I did finally find, after saying I can't find any data, I did find a little bit of data from the Pew Foundation that combines race and age and party identification over time. But the data end in 2017 and they're pretty high level. So they're not very fine grained. There's nothing, no geographic or regional state or anything like that kind of separate analyses. They bounce around a little bit. But the only real point is that older whites are maybe getting more Republican over the last 4, 5, 6 years up until 2017. That's presumably continued since 2017. But the data, we don't have the data to show that. Younger whites are probably getting a little more Democratic, but again, the results kind of bounce around across elections and they end in 2017. So I don't want to put a whole lot of weight on either of those results. I think they're probably both will persist, but it's uncertain. So Catalyst, which is a voting collective, basically it's an organization that collects lots of voting data, to put it at its most simplest. They report, and so they've got millions of voting results. So it's a much more fine-grained analysis than even Pew, which has thousands. They report few differences between 2016 voters and new presidential voters, meaning 2020, within each age group. But the new voters, meaning people who voted in 2020 and had not voted in either 2016 or 2018 or both, are much younger and they're more Democratic. And the new voters are more racially diverse than voters who had voted in the previous presidential election or the previous congressional election. So what we're finding, if this persists after 2020, and that of course is the huge question, is that there's a cohort of new voters. They are disproportionately non-white, and they are disproportionately young, and they are disproportionately Democratic. That's roughly speaking a big part of why Biden ended up with a substantial lead over Trump in the 2020 election as he had. It's certainly not all of it. And there's absolutely no way of knowing whether new voters will persist. We know that people who vote once are a little more likely to vote the next time than people who hadn't voted, but we also know that young voters are relatively volatile in terms of coming in and out of the electorate. We saw that in Virginia 48 hours ago, and there's no particular reason, even setting aside manipulations of the electoral system that have been going on in various states, even setting that aside, there's no guarantee that young voters who voted in one presidential election will continue to do so in the next one. If they do, they're likely to remain with the same party. But the big question is whether they vote. And the question on top of that is whether any voting restrictions that are being imposed by some states or voting leniency, making voting easier, as it happening in other states, is going to have an impact on these new voters. We just don't know. So Catalyst concludes that the data suggests that a good deal of Biden's support in 2020 was driven by new voters who were younger and more diverse than returning voters. So one big conclusion here is get out the vote drives, or some either motivation or mobilization or reason that will change, that will keep the 2020 new voters voting in 2024, perhaps in 2022, is likely to make a very big difference given the demographic changes, given the tendency toward being Democratic among young voters, offsetting perhaps a tendency toward becoming more Republican among older voters. Final slide, one more. And so the question here is what's going to keep, this is very difficult to read, I'm sorry, whether there's, what the Democratic Party can do, apart from what it is doing, to keep these new, young, racially and ethnically diverse voters voting and voting Democratic in 2024, compared with, and analogous to what they did in 2020. If we think that issues matter, And there's a big question about whether issues, in fact, are what motivates people, or at least what contributes to motivating people to vote. Then the Democrats are doing a pretty good job of organizing around the issues that are going to be most appealing to young, racially non-white, plausibly Democratic, but relatively new voters. So this is again, another Pew question from a couple years ago. The question is, what issues are very big problems for the country? It's not quite the most important problem issue, but it's very similar. So what issues do we care about? The issues, and again, it's very hard to read. My apologies. Let me see if I can pull it up on my own screen. So the issues in which young voters were more likely to say that this issue matters than older voters are exactly the issues that at least one wing of the Democratic Party is focused on: climate change, economic inequality, racism, sexism, this is Pew's version, Pew's language, and job opportunities. Those are the issues that young voters care about more than older voters do. And so if, in fact, my apologies, my blind is closing itself. I don't know if you can hear it in the background. If, in fact, the Democratic Party can keep people focused on this set of issues, then the likelihood is reasonably good, or at least better, that young, non-Anglo, democratically inclined voters will persist in 2024. If the issues turn in a different direction, then this population will be less interested and will be less likely to vote or to vote Democratic. All of that's contingent on two things. One is that the census data are in fact an accurate representation of what's happening in the country. And secondly, that issues matter in people's decision about whether to vote. And both of those, it seems to me, are up for grabs. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. All right, now we'll turn it over to Richard Alba.
Okay, let me get my screen share up here, and whoops, I didn't want to start there. Okay, well, again, like Jennifer, I'm really grateful for the invitation, especially as a sociologist and not a political scientist, to join this august group in discussing the 2020 census and the future. And my take, you'll see, is much more sociological than Jennifer's was. So let me start with, and Jennifer's covered some of this. So the headlines from the 2020 census, one big one was a supposed decline in the number of whites for the first time in U.S. history. That was the Washington Post headline. In fact, the very day that the data were released. I may have done Jennifer a wrong by telling her that I was going to say this was wrong. She became very sensitive to the possibility that the numbers aren't trustworthy. And I'll explain as I go along why I don't think that we should believe there was a decline in the number of whites. Nevertheless, it's clear that whites are declining as a fraction of the population. Another big headline that Jennifer covered was slow population growth, and what population growth there was due mainly to the groups that are growing through immigration, notably Asians and Hispanics above all. There was also a considerable growth in the mixed population, and I'm not just going to refer to it as multiracial because what's been elided often in these discussions is the group that is partly Hispanic and partly not. So I'm going to call it an ethno-racially mixed population, and that's where I'm going to put my focus. So let me say a little bit about why I think this is so significant. So the dominant narrative that we have about demography and the American future, and I think it was evident in Jennifer's talk, is the idea of a majority-minority America, which according to the Census Bureau and some demographers is going to occur before mid-century. And I just want to point out a facet of this that I think is particularly falsifiable, and that is that this is a vision of a society that is really riven in two parts along the white people of color fault line. And the way it's presented, there's no overlap. Like you're in one or the other camp. One camp is growing, one camp is declining. The great majority of Americans from ethno-racially mixed backgrounds cross this fault line. They're bridges. They have both white and non-white or Hispanic ancestry and kin. And I think that's really important because that means that from birth they are being brought up in some sense in both of these camps. They have access to whites, the dominant group, and to white culture, as well as access to a minority group and a minority culture. Mixing has been steadily increasing for about half a century. I mean, if we start, let's say, with the 1967 Supreme Court decision, Loving v. Virginia, which invalidated state anti-miscegenation laws, it's just been going up gradually, but very steadily. And if we look at marriage, so 1 in 5 new marriages unites partners from two different major ethno-racial categories like Hispanic and Asian or white and black. That's the Pew estimate. Well, needless to say, this is affecting, the child population. So we can look at birth certificates, which include, of course, children who are also the children of unwed parents as well as married parents. And when we do that, we find that 14 to 15% of all births in the United States today are to parents from two different major categories. The great majority, 75% of these births involve a white parent and a parent who in census terms is non-white, either non-white racially or Hispanic. The big group, it turns out, of mixed infants are those born to a white parent and a Hispanic parent. This, by the way, has been true for decades. So if you go back to mixing in 1980, when it was only 5% of babies were born to parents from two different groups, overwhelmingly in 1980, the Hispanic white group was the big group among those children. So you can see that the racially mixed categories that we tend to think of as very important, black, white, Asian white, are important, but not nearly as important as the Hispanic white category. And there's an interesting category called mixed race and white here, which is 10% of births. And it'll be clear what that category is as I go along. The data, we have a lot of data about the children of coming from mixed families. We could always use more. There are a lot of unanswered questions for sure. But overall, we have enough data to draw some conclusions about kind of where these young people fit in American society. And I think it's a fair judgment, I believe, that most minority white Americans, that is to say, Americans from families that bring together white and minority parents, are really becoming part of the mainstream society. So if we think of the mainstream today as white dominated, then integration into social environments with many whites is obviously a critical measure of mainstream participation. And there's abundant evidence that this is the case for mixed minority white youth. So we know they start life in more favorable circumstances. Their parents have higher education levels than do equivalent minority-only parents. They grow up in neighborhoods where they can mix with whites. They often, by the way, cite whites as their best friends. They have favorable educational outcomes. They live in neighborhoods with many whites. They count whites as their friends when they're adults. They also have high rates of marriage to whites, and I mean the majority of these mixed minority white Americans marry whites. And finally, and this is very important for the discussion to come, they have fluid identities that can be minority only, white only, or mixed, depending on the context. There is one big exception to my statements, and that refers to Black-white individuals who face much more severe barriers to mainstream inclusion than do other mixed individuals. Their experiences are more marked by racism. And we have both subjective and objective indicators of this. Okay, so let's think about this, how this plays out in the census, because I think this is turning out to be a really important story. So in 2000, the census made a major innovation, allowing respondents to report more than one race. Since 2000, we've learned from various research studies that the multiracial option really was not capturing fully the multiracial population, and that has to do with the fluidity of people's identities. So that we have a good study that compares the same individuals in 2000 and in 2010, and the individuals who are mixed at one point are very frequently unmixed at another point. So in 2020, the census undertook an additional step to better measure mixed backgrounds. So below the white and Black race labels, it allowed people to write in ethnic ancestries. And during the processing of the data, these labels were scrutinized by the Bureau, and individuals were, in some cases, reclassified by adding new racial categories. So if you said you were white and you reported one of your ethnic ancestries as Korean, you would also then be categorized as Asian, and now you're mixed. So I think this classification rule explains, first of all, the very large increase, part of the very large increase in multiracial Americans in 2020. And also because in 2020, 90% of multiracial Americans are partly white, it explains the drop in the white population, which in the data that Jennifer showed us is people who are single race white, not mixed race. Okay. Nevertheless, we're still not counting everybody who's mixed, and it's very important to bear in mind that because of the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, specifications of census ethno-racial data collection and classification, and that dates back to a 1997 memo. The census cannot collect data that measures people who are mixed Hispanic and non-Hispanic. So if somebody tries to say, well, I'm Hispanic, but I'm also white, meaning, I have, let's say, Irish ancestry, they are classified in the 2020 census as Hispanic and of white race, but their primary category is Hispanic. So what can we conclude from this? Well, in the 2020 census, 4% of the population was non-Hispanic and mixed race. And I say a decent rule of thumb is that the mixed Hispanic, non-Hispanic group is about the same size as the non-Hispanic mixed race population. So I think from this we can make as a guesstimate that in the 2020 census, 7 to 8% of the population comes from ethno-racially. And of course, this is going to be increasing over time because of the growth of mixing in families that I alluded to earlier. Okay, so final remarks. So I think this growth of the mixed population, which is continuing, is a real challenge for us in terms of the way we tend to think about ethno-racial categories. And that is that we tend to think of them as mutually exclusive. We put every individual into one and only one. And this is also, by the way, the way that the census data are typically presented in terms of mutually exclusive categories. But as I said, people who are mixed have fluid identities. We can't really think of them as kind of being captured then by a single category, whether we call that multiracial or something else. And so we need to begin to think about people as belonging to multiple categories, meaning that our categories are no longer mutually exclusive, and indeed will add up to more than 100%. And I think, of course, this insistence in our minds on using mutually exclusive categories is connected to our acceptance of the majority-minority narrative, which is also a mutually exclusive presentation of our society. And I think, the mixed population, its growing importance, highlights a blind spot, not only in this view of our future, but in the way we are thinking about ethnicity and race in our society. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Richard. All right, next up, I'll turn it over to Rodney.
Okay, good to see everyone. I very much enjoyed Professor Alba and Jennifer's comments. To some degree, my comments may overlap a little bit with Jennifer's in particular. And when I come to those parts, I will try and move a little bit quicker. I know that time is a consideration, so I will try and do that. So let me then go ahead and turn to the points that I'd like to raise in my discussion. Our panel, of course, is on the 2020 census and the future of America. And one thing that I guess I would raise that I thought that has been raised a little bit already, but let me just note it, is that there is and is going to be and is reflected in our discussion already, quite a number of public questions about the quality, the accuracy, the legitimacy, the wording of the census, and many kinds of things. As we all know, there was a lot of debate and discussion about whether the census was being done at all correctly, whether there were insufficient counting, et cetera, et cetera. So there are I think, and will continue to be over some period of time, considerable debate about what the numbers really mean for reasons that have already been identified, but I think for some additional reasons as well. So what I'm going to do here is to provide several pieces of evidence or information that I have handy that is meant to complement, but is also somewhat apart from the census. So I'm going to rely on two kinds of sources of evidence that I'm working on or have been involved in some way, directly or indirectly. One is the collaborative multiracial post-election survey, which is it had an N of like 4,000 Latinos, 4,000 Asians, 4,000 Blacks, and 3,000 Anglos as they're white Anglos as they're typically defined. The way it works is that the people were contacted, says, are you of this racial ethnic background? If they said yes, then they were asked a variety of questions that to some degree reflected that self-identification. Now, based on what Richard and I suspect Jennifer would say is that, well, there's kind of a self-reinforcement or reification of this, given the way that the questions are posed. So I'll try and take that into account. But again, the first piece of information that I would draw upon to some degree is the CMPS. The second is some data on the State Diversity Project, which is kind of an echo of some work that I did many, many years ago. And I'm trying to do a little bit of work on trying to revisit that and whether what I did at that point held up at that time, and more importantly, whether it has any resonance for situations today. All right. So here's some other evidence that comes from the CMPS that speaks to things a little bit. And I apologize for the very inelegant quality of my slides. But let me go ahead and suggest this. In the CMPS, one of the questions was, which racial category did you, and now I'm focusing on Latinos who were self-identified, choose on the 2020 census? So there is, of course, saying, okay, the census occurred. How did you answer that? Among Latinos, interestingly, 45% said white, 29% said some other race. So, these patterns I think are a little bit unique, but they're also not entirely different from other analyses we've seen in the past. But I think it's interesting that you see this continuing kind of difficulty or struggle, if you will, in terms of Latinos' self-identification. And this may also occur with Asians, and less so with the other two racial ethnic groups. But I think in some respects, Latinos have been kind of at the forefront of this ambiguity. And I think Richard's commentary underscores that. We'll see if he agrees with me or not when we come to that. Another set of questions that was asked in these surveys are the following. In the CMPS, 73%, Latinos and all the groups were asked, do you think of yourself as a distinct racial group? In the CMPS of 2020, 73% of Latinos said that they thought Latinos were, quote, a distinctive racial group, which, has been somewhat surprising, and I'll refer to that again momentarily. There was also a CMPS administered in the year 2016. They have occurred at the same years as presidential elections, as you can see. And at that time, 60% of the Latinos said that they were a distinctive racial group. What might explain that upsurge? I really can't tell you. I mean, I guess we could speculate about that, but just to note that. And for a little bit of a broader comparison, I was involved in something called the Latino National Survey in 2007. And that was a survey of Latinos only in the US. But when we asked the questions about how they thought of themselves in terms of racial identification, other race was 67%. And we asked, do you think of Latinos as a distinct race? And over half said yes to that. So, there's some interesting data here. Another thing that was asked on the CMPS was about, did you complete the 2020 census? And according to what the top lines tell us, 17% of Latinos said they did not complete the census. Why that is, I'm not sure. Whether, I don't know the exact reasoning, but what stands out, I think, is that if you compare Latinos with whites, 4%, Blacks, 8%, Asians, 6%, Latinos were much more likely to say that they had not completed the 2020 census. Another question that was asked on the CMPS, by the way, I was involved in having some questions on the CMPS, but a number of these, none of these are really, quote, my questions, are ones that I submitted. So I'm drawing from someone else's questions that were on there that have been made available to us who were involved in it. In any case, the question was, what is the importance of blank identity to you personally? And so they were asked to, like, what is the most, first, second, third, fourth, etc. And so what I have here very quickly is what the various groups said, and I have them in order of who said the most in terms of each category. So here we say among Blacks, 45% that a racial identity was important to them personally. Among the second highest group was, interestingly, Asians, 25% of whom said it was the most important, and 21% said it was the second most important. Among Latinos, 24 and 17. So Asians and Latinos are fairly close to each other in that regard. Again, this is aggregated Latinos, aggregated Asians. And I know one might raise a question, well, if you disaggregate by national origin group and or other factors, we might come to different conclusions. So this is very aggregated data, to be sure. But in any case, so again, Blacks, 45% said very important, Asians 25, Latinos 24, whites were the least likely to say that a racial identity was important to them. So 7% said it was very important, and 10% said it was of secondary importance. Another question that was asked is, how important is American identity to you? And here we see whites were the most likely to say that, 36%, and 50% said it's of secondary importance. So if you add that up, whites are very heavily saying this is pretty darn important to me. Among Asians, it was 21 and 8, Latinos 17 and 9, and Blacks were the least likely to say that, quote, American identity was of the highest importance to them. So, these kind of self-identities, again, maybe the questions aren't the best, but they get at something. And let me just then contrast that a little bit with some other responses about identity. So one of the questions was, how important is a cultural identity to you personally? And here the numbers are fairly low overall, but the ordering of them is kind of interesting, I think. So again, Asians, 15% said it was of the most important, 20% said secondary, Latinos, 13 and 17, adding up to 30 among those two categories, white, 7 and 12, and blacks, the least likely to say that this was important to them. Two other points that I would just quickly suggest. They were asked, how important is a class identity to you? And by and large, across all four of these racial ethnic groups, very few said that that was a first or secondary identity. It would typically be on the order of 7% would say, yeah, first, and another 5 or 8% would say yes. But if you add those up, they're much less than some of the other ones that I've already identified, the racial and the American identities. Finally, in terms of party identity, it's interesting that these were also said to be very low across all the groups. Again, if you look at the saying, yes, it's a first order or a second order, it's really quite low, which is interesting to see because, you know, one of our contemporary understandings or narratives is the importance of political party in a variety of ways. This is not saying that it's not important, but it's saying that they are not the first things that are identified by most individuals, which in some respects is not surprising. I think, you know, many people would think of other identities, but then under certain circumstances, we would expect that party means a lot more. So these are probably all conditional or contingent, I would suggest. But in general, I'm just trying to give you this broad lay of the land here. Another thing to try and think about, and this is kind of echoing what Jennifer said, is that I've done quite a bit of work on state politics and racial diversity in the states. And one of the things that I looked at in this book that I did that Gabe mentioned from many years ago called Faces of Inequality, Social Diversity, American Politics, is that at that time I was able to collect data on the white ethnic and the minority population. And based on different configurations of those populations, I categorized the states of the US as homogeneous, heterogeneous, and bifurcated. Bifurcated would mean large minority population, but a majority white population. Heterogeneous means that there was a mix, including the white ethnic population. In many states, white ethnic was a defining feature of that heterogeneity. So the Italians, the Irish, the old immigrants, if you will. And then homogeneous means that they were very heavily white. And based on that, I looked at various kinds of public policy outcomes. And there were a couple of what I thought were interesting kinds of findings. One is that if you looked at certain kinds of outcomes with regard to, let's say, incarceration rates or education outcomes and so on, as you might expect, the homogeneous states came out the best, that is having the better outcomes overall. But then if you disaggregated the data by race and said, okay, what is the situation for whites versus minorities in this state? Oftentimes, there was the greatest disparity under those circumstances. I mean, it's kind of an echo, or, you know, I recognize that this is only an anecdote, but, you know, what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin? What happened in Minneapolis? Both states that are historically quite homogeneous by many definitions in American society. And as you may know, historically, Wisconsin has had one of the largest disparities in terms of incarceration rates by a large margin. Now that's closed a little bit over time, but I guess I would just note that. But again, I found that many years ago. So I'm trying to follow up some of that. And I guess I would just very quickly note that my very preliminary findings about some of these phenomena, that is the disparate kinds of outcomes and so on, are related to interracial economic disparity. It's not so much the size of the group, it's the interracial economic disparity that seems to be explaining differential outcomes. We're very early in our analysis, but that's what it seems to suggest. And Gabe, it just indicated to me I have 2 minutes. I certainly want to respect that, and I will go as fast as I can, I promise. So just to refer back to the census, if you probably have seen that the census created this diversity index for the nation as a whole, and it also did it by state. But just to very quickly note, according to their measure, and again, I know this is being disputed to some degree on the panel, understandably. In 2020, that was the diversity index was 61, while it was 55 in 2010. It was kind of a Herfindahl index, if you're familiar with that. A couple of things I will very quickly note is that what's interesting, if you look at some of the states, that you can interpret their situation very differently depending on how you measure their difference over time. So if you look at Connecticut and Vermont, both of their indexes increased by 9 points over time. But if you look at the starting point for the two, Connecticut increased by 22% and Vermont increased by 82%. And that's partly because the baseline was so low. But just to think about that, and again, as we think about these things, as I mentioned, we might debate or think about whether we think we should think about these things in terms of size of populations or the growth rate of populations, and how we measure growth rates, another question. I would just skip over this. I'm trying to argue here that there is a lot of change, but also some continuity, and I have this quick way of trying to summarize that. I will go past that. And then get to some of the issues of that again, kind of revisit some of what Jennifer talked about. And that is looking at the states on the whole in terms of different dimensions of their politics and society and so on. If you look at the socioeconomic status of the four major racial ethnic groups, perhaps not surprisingly, it tends to stack up this way across the states: Asians, white, Latino, Latinas, and then blacks. But then if you look at political processes, things like voter turnout, voting behavior, party ID, and so on, you get a somewhat different picture. And then third, if you look at actual public policies and other kinds of aspects of what I call governance or representation, draws a slightly different kind of interpretation. And if we have time, I can come back to a couple of points that are raised there. This is just another way of stating what I just said. That is that there's these three dimensions. This is meant to suggest the socioeconomic, the political processes, and the formal institutions. And the argument is we have to understand the role of race and diversity within and across and between all of those. And then finally, I just have a number of questions that I would end with. That is looking back and then looking forward. How will we think about the data? What do the numbers say or didn't say? I think that will be kind of debated, as it has already today, over time. And when we look at these data, are people going to refer to what the census tells us or other sources? How do we interpret that? And how will that evidence apply in different arenas and so on? And from my standpoint, what's quite important is how those facts, so to speak, are distributed across the states and localities in the US, because I think that's very important. And it's not only what there is out there, but how it's distributed through our federal system. I have a number of other points here and there, but I will stop at this point and revisit them if and as we would like. Thank you very much, Gabe, and I'm sorry if I went over.
No, that was just perfect. Thank you so much, Rodney. All right, next I will turn it over to Karthick.
Thank you, Gabe. And I do have some slides. I'll ask if folks can put it up. But, I was like, I don't want to be left naked here when everyone else got slides and all I got is like being able to talk. But as you'll, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And Eva, if you are able to screen share, please do. If not, I will go with my earlier plan and just deliver my remarks without slides.
I think Rachel's getting them up. Just go ahead and start talking and
okay,
we'll get it up.
So greetings from, okay, let's see if you can just refresh it. There's actually one slide just prior to this. If you can just, I think. So we'll wait for that to come up. Yes, there we go. So greetings from the state of California. I think it's interesting to have all these conversations about what a non-white majority future might look like for the country when California and a few other states are already here, and California went through these conversations about 30 years ago. One of the things I've said in different contexts, and I think in many ways, we wish that we had it in person. I think for a topic like this, it is really important that we are, I wish that more social science researchers would spend time in California and talk to people who have been in California for several, actually, these are not further slides. If you could just stay on that first slide, I would be grateful. And to spend more time in California, because, and not to say that as California goes, so goes the nation in every single way. And a lot of folks, including Professor Manuel Pastor, has talked about the Prop 187 moment in California. And are we seeing that with Trump and Trumpism nationally? I think the answer is more complicated than saying yes. What the Republican Party just experienced nationally with Trump and Trumpism is a nationalization of Prop 187. And I'll say more about why federalism matters and why we need to pay attention to California, but also note that there will be variation as we move forward in a federalism context. But that said, what it means to be multiracial, what it means to have a rapidly growing Asian American population, what it means for whiteness when you don't have a majority white population. I mean, California has shown in many ways what all of this has meant and what it might mean for other states and for the country. So that's something I would just say is something that'll be just really important to pay attention to. Next slide, please. And this comes from an image in Wikipedia. As fraught as it might be to talk about quote unquote majority minority, here are the states where non-Hispanic whites are not a majority of the population. That's in orange. And then those in yellow are states where they are less than 60% of the population. So these are places that might follow the lead of those states in orange. Next slide. In making my remarks, I'll also just draw lightly and sometimes heavily on some of my prior works, including work with colleagues on Asian American political behavior, work on framing, including framing immigrants, but thinking about terminology and frames that we use. And when I say we, I mean not only that elected officials and media entities use, but even academics, and why we need to just be really mindful of the kinds of terminology that we use and to unpack that and to consider changing some of the phrases that we use. Also draw on some work from the New Immigration Federalism to talk about changes over time in restrictive policies as they involve immigrants and the extent to which demographic factors may or may not be helpful in explaining that variation over time. Next slide. I'm also going to be a little bit provocative, right? Some of the maybe more academic conversations we're having might have been previewed in Public Enemy's 1990 album, Fear of a Black Planet. I would encourage you to listen to that song if you haven't heard it, where there is a particular refrain where they talk about essentially any combination that is not a white father and a white mother will produce Black babies, right? And so just as we think about a future of whiteness being renewed through multicultural, multiracial identification and interracial marriage, it's possible that we have a different kind of future, quote unquote, mainstream that is not defined by whiteness, but perhaps by something else. And also to think about the power of the one-drop rule, and Richard has hinted at that, right? There's something that is still so powerful with the one-drop rule that forces us to think about race, not just in demographic terms, but what is it about these systems of racism and accumulated histories of, from the histories of slavery to also genocide of Native peoples that we need to keep in mind in terms of what is the future of race in America. It's not simply just looking at a kind of population basis of self-identification as providing the answer. I would also ask you to draw attention to politics. When you look at white anxiety about the future of America from scholarship by Richard and others, and there's good reason to think that misleading framing or maybe just framing on what that white non-majority in the future looks like is the most or one of the most significant drivers of white resentment or white anxiety. But perhaps the biggest earthquake that the nation felt in 2008 was Barack Obama's election. We did not see a significant, it's still on the same slide, we did not see a significant change in the Black population or the non-white population that led many Americans to join the Tea Party and saying that this is not my president, I don't recognize my country anymore. It was not because of population change. It was a simple flip of who was occupying the White House and millions of people who could not come to terms with that perceived loss of power as a social group. So we need to take that into account when we think about what are the drivers of racial attitudes. And it'll go well beyond demographic realities. Next slide. So thinking about Prop 187, one of the interpretations of Prop 187, as well as other racially divisive propositions in California in the 1980s and 1990s, was this pattern that California found itself in, where you have a white majority electorate that had a lot of political power that could single-handedly dictate the terms of elections, feeling a sense of anxiety with a growing brown or growing non-white majority emerging into power and passing various ballot propositions to try to punish those groups that were seen as potential future usurpers of that power. Now, the story of Prop 187 is also the story of a long-term decline of the Republican Party, where you only had essentially two statewide Republicans elected since Prop 187, since Pete Wilson, since Pete Wilson's since his governorship, as a cautionary tale for anti-immigrant politics and racially divisive politics as a recipe for disaster for the National Republican Party. I think what we've seen in Virginia, and I think what we'll continue to see, is that the national story is more complicated than that. Part of it, by the way, and I'd love to talk about it more in the Q&A, is what does the future of Latinos look like? I mean, Jennifer, I think it was really intriguing what you showed in terms of patterns in the 2020 election, but what we saw then, and even what we're seeing, at least from what we can detect in Virginia, is that there may be some softening moving into the future. I just saw a very recent paper that's also very provocative, that the proportion of Hispanics identifying as white increased among those who shifted to voting for Trump in 2016. I think there's all sorts of fascinating stuff about how racial identification and politics come into the mix now and potentially into the future. But what Prop 187 did, thank you, Gabe. What Prop 187 did is that it led to a long-term decline of Republican power in California. It also paved the way for a lot of Latino elected officials who grew up in the immigrant rights movement to come to political power. You saw social movements also gaining strength in the wake of Prop 187 to end up passing a lot of pro-immigrant laws in California. And you see some of this happening in other states as well. Next slide. But Prop 187 in California is not the entire story. So just as I talked about that 2008 moment in which all of a sudden you saw millions of Americans feeling like their racial group was under siege and losing power and finding ways either explicitly or implicitly to support movements as well as candidates that would restore white power. You also see this happening on the progressive side. So this is an example that we highlight in the New Immigration Federalism to show how much political dynamics play a role, not just demographic dynamics, in terms of what states do with respect to immigration-related policies. So if you look at states that allowed for anyone, regardless of their immigrant status or citizenship status, to have a state driver's license, in 2000, you have 9 states that allowed it. But soon after 9/11, you saw a precipitous decline in the number of states that allowed those without federal legal status to have a driver's license. And so that's a punctuated equilibrium. You had this shock, and you had many states, even though they could continue to allow it, to drop driver's licenses for unauthorized immigrants. But between 2011 and 2013, you saw a major increase. Now, you have many scholars who think that immigration-related policies at the state and local level are demographically driven. There was no sudden influx of Latinos or non-white immigrants into the United States or into these states after 2000 that caused that drop in state driver's licenses. Similarly, there was no big increase from 2011 to 2013 that caused this increase. What happened between that time period? DACA happened. Because of deferred action for childhood arrivals, you had many states that had to grant licenses to DACA recipients, and that created momentum for advocates within these states to say, well, if DACA recipients can have driver's licenses, why not other unauthorized immigrants? So those dynamics are important to pay attention to. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll just say, let's enter into this realm of federalism. So building on that work with the new immigration federalism, my most recent book, this time with my former grad student, Alan Coburn, who's a professor at Arizona State University, we look at federalism and the expansion and contraction of citizenship rights. Next slide. Now, most of us think of federalism and civil rights in a very negative light. Essentially, that if you give states greater leeway on rights, that states, especially conservative states, will do everything in their power to oppress minority populations and immigrant populations. Next slide. But we have to remember that federalism also has a progressive dynamic. And we would not have had national suffrage without having these experiments in various states of women being accorded the right to vote. Next slide. Similarly, when it comes to LGBT rights. Next slide. And this goes to that fundamental notion that Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, where states can be laboratories of innovation. Next slide. So what we do in this book, this is a summary image of the book, and there's a lot that is packed here. And I think I'll just stay here without going to any further slides. One is thank you, I have 2 minutes. So one is to think about citizenship as not something that is exclusive to the national level. To think about state citizenship as well as local citizenship. And this is not some fantasy in which we're just talking about citizenship as a political attitude or some kind of expression. We believe that it's possible to ground this in rights. And what we do is to sketch out 5 dimensions of rights. One, the right to free movement. Unlike what that Southwest Airlines ad says, not everyone is free to move about the country in the same way. So what does the federal government, what do state governments, what do local governments do to either enable or restrict the movement of populations, including things like stop and frisk, including things like racial profiling when it comes to immigration status or presumed criminality. Second, the right to due process and legal protection. We show how this varies across states. We also talk about the right to develop human capital. So the US Supreme Court has ruled that states cannot limit the right to K-12 education, but that's not enshrined in the Constitution. Where does that come from? So we talk more generally about the right to develop human capital, the right to those fundamental assets that everyone needs in order to thrive. That's where you can talk about a right to healthcare. You can talk about a right to housing. You can talk about a right to clean water. Next, we talk about the right to participate and be represented. And this is not only voting, but even what counts for matters of apportionment and redistricting. These are big debates that are going on right now. And we dodged a bullet in some ways where the Trump administration wanted to restrict representation only to those populations who were adult citizens and non-US residents. And then finally, the right to identify and belong. You have states like California and others that have removed any mention of the word alien in their state codes because they see that as alienating language. Moving away from immigrant rights, you also have states that allow people to not have to force to choose between male and female and to have some other gender identity as part of their driver's licenses. Finally, we talk about progressive, reinforcing, and regressive citizenship. Progressive citizenship means states that establish regimes that expand rights beyond those accorded at the national level. Regressive are states that remove those rights. So the Jim Crow era is a perfect example, but Arizona and many other states today, when it comes to immigrant rights, are also examples. By the way, states like Florida and Georgia that are restricting voting rights are also instances of regressive state citizenship. And then finally, reinforcing state citizenship, states that take federal rights or federal basis of rights as a template to reinforce at the state level. So a state that says you need to have federal legal status in order to drive is actually doesn't have to do it, but it's using a federal template to then reinforce it at the state level in terms of access to various rights. So I'll stop there, and I'll just say the final word is when we think about the future, we should be, actually, if you can go to the last slide, and this invokes the work of Dow Myers, who came up with a book over a decade ago. It's just all the way to the very end, called Boomers and Immigrants. What should we be thinking about and what should we worry about? We should worry about the aging of the US population. We should be worried about immigrants not being a sizable enough number that they will help lift up our social security system. We should also be thinking about what the future of immigration might look like. Now, if you think about the third largest country today in terms of population is the United States. I don't know how many of you have thought about what is the third largest country by population by the year 2100. I'll save you the trouble. It's Nigeria. How much are we thinking about Nigerian immigration to the United States? Perhaps it's something we should be wary of, but I would say something that we should welcome, especially given the prospects of population decline, if not population aging, and a shrinking workforce as we look ahead to the end of the century. I look forward to the conversation, and I think there's going to be a lot to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthick, and thank you to all the panelists for those fascinating presentations. Just encourage people to post questions to the Q&A, and panelists should feel free to answer some of those just by typing in, if for sort of simple and straightforward ones. I guess when I step back and think about a panel with the title that we have today, The Future of America and 2020 Census, the question that is on my mind, and I think on many other people's minds too, is that the country is going through this massive demographic transition that to some extent all of you have spoken about and talked about. And the country has gone through similar transitions in the past, and they haven't always gone nicely. And a lot of people feel like this one currently isn't going so well either, and definitely have great fears about maintaining our democracy, about the extent of polarization, the extent of income inequality, all these really worried about violence. And so I guess the one question for any panelists or all panelists who want to weigh in is, if you had to pick something that we could do, or research that we could do on topics that would help ease this transition that we're going through, what would it be? And I wonder if the census should stop, maybe to start with Richard, what census should stop reporting numbers quite as they do, might be one strategy.
Well, I think that Karthick alluded to something that is really important, and that is the way the numbers are framed. And, that was what I was calling attention to in talking about how the census constructs ethno-racial categories. And I do think that we could certainly devise frames, and Dal Myers and Mars Levy have done some research on this, on alternative narratives of demographic change, showing that the one that is currently dominant, which sees America as divided really into two parts, one ascending and one descending, is really, rather polarizing, and and there's a lot of social psychological research by people like Jennifer Richardson of Yale that shows that whites respond pretty negatively when they are prompted to think about the majority minority idea of the American future. I think we have alternative ways to look at this, and in fact, we could draw on some on our history. I mean, it's true that our history has other polarizing moments, but we went through a tremendous change after World War II, which really submerged to some extent the power of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group that had defined itself previously as the real America. And I think it's possible for us to develop that kind of shift again, but I admit that we're a long way from it.
Okay, can I make two quick comments in response to your question?
Please, of course.
Um,
Absolutely.
One of them is a really classic professorial wonky answer, which is, Richard already has alluded to it, teach the history, right? I mean, one of my favorite quotes of all times is Stephen Colbert, who testified before a congressional hearing in which he said, my great grandfather didn't cross the Atlantic Ocean in the steerage in order to be overrun by immigrants, right? I mean, in order to live in a country that's overrun by immigrants. So there's something deeply, deeply ironic about essentially the entire white population, never mind other populations. This does not include the African-American population for obvious reasons, being in a big panic about immigrants from weird countries, right? I mean, here we all are. And so part of what I want to say, again, this isn't really a solution, but part of what I want to say is, relax, we've been there, done that. Now, we did it in part by pretty much cutting off immigration from those weird countries in 1924. So it's not altogether a model history, but taking seriously the American myth of being a land of immigrants. Give me your tired, you're poor, blah, 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 blah. Why we don't take more advantage of that? I think there are good reasons. I'm not a believer that, if you change civic education in high school, you're going to make people, but nonetheless, that remains as a paradox to me. The other one that I think is a more immediately salient, and this is something that Rodney is certainly the expert on, Karthick, maybe anybody other than me, is, and it alludes to what both you and Richard were just saying, the commitment to identify both the internal commitment, but also the advocacy and political commitment to identify Latinx as a separate race, analogous to Black, white, Asian, Native Americans. I do it. I mean, we all write the same, regression analyses or tables. I mean, I did it half an hour ago. And I get the emotional attachment to that to some degree. And it's an instrumental attachment to that because it gives you access to the civil rights, both legislative and regulatory system, but also the emotional and political and advocacy power of that history. Having said that, there's an argument, I think there's an empirical argument about, and again, this is more Richard's territory than mine. There's are American Hispanics really the Irish and the Italians of the 21st century? I mean, to what degree is there genuine movement across borders, metaphorical identity borders, as Rich has been describing, but also slow and eventual movement into, roughly speaking, whiteness, or racial mixture that includes white, blah, 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 blah. So the politics around identification of Latinx especially, although I think you could tell a somewhat parallel story around Asian Americans, given high rates of intermarriage and so on. the emotional attachment to separation rather than merging, it seems to me is a really interesting, complicated political phenomenon. I'm not even sure which side I'm on. But more research on how to think about that question seems to me would be useful. And, you know, that's a controversial statement in the academy under these days. I understand that. So I'm not sure I would make it except among friends, but I think we take for granted. Anyway, I'll stop.
I guess if I could chime in, and I'll try and be very brief. You know, some of the work I've been doing for quite a while now tries to look at Latinos and their attitudes and so on. And one of the things I've become very interested in, almost fixated upon, is questions about Latinos and their core values. There's a lot of research that says, you know, do you believe in this policy or that policy? Do you have solidarity, blah, blah. The questions we ask are things like, if you work hard, you can do well in the United States. If you don't do well, it's your responsibility. If people don't do well, should we help those who really try? And it's really interesting that Latinos are as emphatic, arguably, in ways as others are. And in fact, one of the interesting things that we're finding is that if you look at Latino Democrats and Latino Republicans on those kinds of questions, they're actually much closer to each other than Latino Democrats are to white Democrats, than Latino Republicans are to white Republicans. So there is this kind of underlying value structure that I think is along the lines of what I think both Richard and Jennifer are suggesting here, that there is grounds for this. And to some degree, it's a matter of recognizing, highlighting, and so on. That's not to say that discrimination is going to evaporate. I'm not going to be that Pollyannish about it. But I do think there are some important grounds that if people knew this more and understood it more, that there is in fact sharing in common values in many respects that's understudied and underappreciated, that could have some impact.
So I'm just gonna, Gabriel, just a quick thing on the question that you tossed up, and I'll follow the rules of threes, right? One, you know, given this moment, I agree with you, it's a really fraught moment. And when you talk about violence, right, especially in terms of anti-Asian violence in light of COVID, I mean, there are people getting killed, there are people getting beat up. There are people that are either presumed vectors of disease, presumed terrorists, presumed quote unquote illegals, whose livelihoods, right? And even that's part of like what Tomás Jiménez talks about, this replenished ethnicity too. It's like, we have these moments, especially of people that are presumed foreigners, where it might not be this kind of linear process. So what can we do? What can we do as public intellectuals? What can we do just as resident citizens like everyone else? And then what can we do as scholars? One, as public intellectuals, Richard is absolutely right. There are things that we could do to reframe, but that's going to be really tough when you have candidates that win elections based on fear mongering. Now that is just like, to combat that, I think then you try to get all these other institutions that might unwittingly be accomplices in that narrative to do better. So I think that's something we can do as public intellectuals, to get institutions that are not invested and in a winning based on that divisive strategy. What can we do as citizens? You know, you're seeing efforts like the Illinois state legislature that passed legislation saying that you need more Asian American history in classrooms. And the presumption there is that the more you can educate the next generation, they realize that Asian Americans have been here for centuries and they've been part of the social fabric. They're not these foreign threats. And on the matter of threat, this is what we can do as scholars. This is something I would say, political scientists, please think about the uncritical way that we might be using some of this terminology. And I say this as someone, maybe it's because I'm not a white scholar, but this notion of racial threat used uncritically has always bothered me, because it somehow lends legitimacy to this notion that white people have a legitimate sense of threat, that somehow Black people moving into your neighborhood, immigrants moving to your neighborhood, that's a kind of natural reaction, as opposed to something that should be problematized. Now, imagine if you used a word like white moral panic. That makes the problem not the entering population, but the population that is somehow invested in a particular way of being and that somehow an other showing up is going to turn everything topsy-turvy. I would at the very least say that if you hold those up as alternative frames, we can have a productive conversation on how scholars might be unwittingly lending into this notion that somehow the normal state of affairs is a status quo where whites feel comfortable and the entrance of another population is a legitimate threat. I think that's a word that is quite loaded and that stacks the deck in thinking about what the problem is.
Thanks. Well, we have, believe it or not, actually gone beyond our normal amount of time, thanks to all the sort of thoughtful questions. I guess since no one seems to be turning off their cameras quite yet, are there any questions or comments the panelists really wanted to get out there to make to each other? I know there was lots of interesting material there.
Do we have time for a couple questions or comments from the audience? I feel awful bad about all of us talking too much.
If you
Maybe
have
we don't
time
have
for it,
time.
well, we can make time for it. And to some extent, that question, the first question I did ask, did come from a set of questions that audience members posted ahead of time. All right, let's just do two real quick from the audience. So one question that was asked now and actually asked by other people yesterday as well was, should we believe in a stable Democratic majority emerging based on the data we've seen so far?
I think it's tough to predict. I mean, we're seeing it right now. I mean, you have these dynamics that go even beyond race, right? When you have states that have traditions of voting against the incumbent White House party, like, you think of those dynamics. But even in terms of, I think the biggest question into 22 and 24 will be, those dynamics we saw in South Texas and South Florida, how much of those are geographically isolated examples of Latinos still largely voting Democratic, but starting to shift more towards the Republican Party. A lot of that will depend on whether we're talking about Trump in 22 and 24 or not as a factor. But then what about beyond that? I don't see stability, at least for the next decade.
Very quickly, I agree. And in part for reasons that Rodney's talking about, and that I think I completely agree that we need more on that. There's a lot of reasons that we might imagine some non-Anglos, Latinx maybe especially, as being quite attracted by a relatively, center-right, conservative, economically focused political party. Set aside Trump, as a wild card, who knows what to think about him, but the underlying structure of ethnic politics is not, I was making the pitch that it could plausibly be increasingly democratic on the part of the young adults, but I could almost equally make the pitch that says, no, that's actually not right, that there's no reason to assume. The Black population, again, is somewhat different because there's such a very deep history for the last 50 years, and that's more complicated. But I think the Latinx population, the Asian American population are kind of more or less up for grabs by a smart center-right party.
Yeah, I want to just add one thought into the mix, and that is that don't neglect that there really is some ongoing assimilation as manifested by by intermarriage and people of mixed backgrounds. So there are many minorities and mixed people who are integrating into white milieus. So no big surprise, I think if they take on some of the political attitudes that they encounter there.
Yes.
And the Latinx population is really very diverse in these terms, I think. We underestimate how many people are not living in ethnic enclaves. They're living in mixed environments, often with many whites. They are intermarried with whites. They have grown up in partly white families. These are important factors.
And I think there's some complexity here too, right? So,
yeah,
with mixed white Asian folks in the context of COVID, that their Asian identities get primed more, right? Also, when you look at the Asian American population, this is research that I and others do, between 26 and 2020, what we saw was increased support for Trump among Vietnamese American voters, but decreased support among Chinese American voters. So I think candidates matter, party positions on issues matter, especially for immigrant, naturalized citizens and second generation immigrant voters, where party identification is not as strong. And so they are paying attention to issue positions, but also, am I welcomed into this party or not? I think, Jennifer, what you talked about, kind of not just economic conservatism, I think COVID played a role there and continues to play a role in terms of what parents feel or even workers feel, right? In terms of what are their interests beyond, say, their race or their immigrant status, that parties and candidates may be taking for granted and need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David Hollinger, the historian, writes a thoughtful question in the Q&A. He says, we have long understood that the census is predominantly prescriptive and it tells people what identities they're allowed to choose. I've seen research along those lines in many countries. And then he writes, by so often reinforcing these census-prescribed identities, do social scientists encourage identity politics instead of encouraging voters to think of themselves as having interests beyond their ethno-racial identities? Many observers tell us that the big issue today is the future of democracy itself. This is true. How can social scientists encourage voters to look beyond their ethno-racial identities in order to save democracy?
I'll just say a couple of quick things. One, we bemoan party polarization and division, but in an ironic way, you can say that parties are integrating mechanisms, right? Unless, all white people were Republicans and all Republicans were white people, or say all Democrats were people of color and vice versa. So to some extent, party competition and party loyalty might actually be good and serving an integrating function. But ironically, some of those divisions are threatening democracy in other ways. I think this is it's a complicated question, and I think it's a complicated answer in terms of, what is dividing us more? If you maybe just bluntly put it, is race dividing us more or party? I don't know. It's a toxic mix of the two right now.
Yeah, just very quickly, the question that is posed there, I think, is one that has been raised a number of times, and that is, do you reify, do you reinforce these identities? Of course, and is there a certain essentialism about it that is posed by that? And I think there's reason to be concerned about that, to be sure. But I think given the way that American society has developed and evolved over time, part of the reason those categories were kind of identified is because they were meant to kind of undo some of the categories that were used decades before that created those situations to begin with. So, we are in this situation of trying to correct, but we may, one of the criticisms is, do we overcorrect? I mean, that, John Roberts says we don't need Shelby versus Holder. We don't need this anymore. Others say, no, look, you're really missing the point. So this is one of the, not surprisingly, as given who's posing the question, he acknowledges and pinpoints a central dilemma in American democracy. We know other countries like France and others try and say, look, there is no race, et cetera, but that hasn't worked great either. It's complicated. I hate to be so trite, but it's really complicated. And one could see, to ignore it is problematic. So it's a matter not only whether you engage it, but I think how you engage it. And I think that's part of what, the question that you posed to us at the end of after we made our presentations, Gabe, is, I think our collective kind of responses to that say, yes, we are aware of the complexity, the difficulty, the normative concerns, and so on. But we do think there is a way forward that doesn't ignore the past.
I think, though, that I want to throw in an idea that Ken Pruitt raises in his book, What is Your Race? And, I think it's, obvious we all know that race measurement in the census is, as Rodney was saying, is there because of social justice concerns, or at least today it's there because of social justice concerns. We're trying to measure the inequalities that still exist because of historical injustices and that deserve to be remedied. But he points out that, in the decennial census, the census questionnaire that everybody gets, that gets highlighted, race is there, but there's no measure of social class. If we had a measure of social class that we gave also prominence to in terms of the data presentation from the census, it would have a kind of, a cross-cutting impact to the salience that we're giving race. So there is a sense, then, I think, in which, because we're making race so prominent through the census, it does contribute in some ways to the.
But race is there because of slavery, Richard. I mean, it's like we measure this because we know, right, from the beginning. And by the way, these don't change. Your income might change, your education might change very quickly.
No.
Your perceived race. No, some of that is changing, but it's less.
Fundamental division. Come on.
Yeah.
And we're doing it more or less. Yeah.
Income does not change in the United States very much. Education doesn't change in the United States very much. If Richard is right, race is actually changing as much as income and education are.
Oh, okay. We can. This is an empirical question.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a great empirical question. One last comment that I know we need to either move on to the next question or stop. So I was about to disagree with Richard in response to David's question. Americans have, the left has always wanted Americans and to think about class, and it doesn't work. It doesn't happen in the United States very much. I mean, we had, a populist moment. And again, I shouldn't say this to a historian in the audience or historians, and more generally, but I'm with you in wishing that we paid much more attention to class, not necessarily instead of race, but certainly in combination, et cetera, et cetera. And the census's obsession with tiny, tiny, tiny little group categories conveys a symbolic statement that race matters and class doesn't. I agree with that. Having said that, I think it's pretty deeply baked. I mean, my guess is that if we stop paying less attention to race or racial identity, as more precisely defined by David Hollinger, we might get back to religion. Right? I mean, and it's not clear to me that religious divides, I mean, look at the history of Europe for the last, 600 or 800 years, perhaps, or the history of much of the Middle East, or the history of, it's not clear to me that religious divides are really preferable. So if we believe the psychologists that, at least in the history of the United States, class does not have the emotive, tribal, to use a undesirable word these days, attachment. We don't have a Marxist, anyway. So it's not clear to me that we could develop class identities or class alliances rather than racial or arguably religious ones. And it's not clear to me that religious identity is preferable to racial. So.
Well, it is interesting, we talk about class, but as we all know, there are dimensions of class. One of the splits we hear these days is college educated, not college educated. And so is it income, education, wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I guess I'm someone who has, I agree with Jennifer very much. It doesn't seem like class catches on. In the survey that I showed you very quickly, ask about your identities, and class is really nowhere. And then a number of years ago, with the task force that I did with the APSA, Michael Jones Correa and others did a paper on Latinos and their sense of class. And it surprisingly, and I still find it surprising, nonetheless, the evidence suggests that for some reason it doesn't catch on. As something that could be a unifying force or something that overrides some other consideration. Nonetheless, I think we need to think more and more about how they might or do or can interconnect.
And of course, as Richard might well answer, if I shut up and give him a chance to answer, it's all endogenous, right? I mean, one reason we don't talk about class is because you think race matters, and one reason race matters is because we don't talk about class, and the political parties are organized around race rather than around class. And
so let me just jump on this
so
one,
it's all mush.
Right. But I think going back to Rodney's thing about places that don't collect data on race like France, lo and behold, have racial problems even though they don't collect the data. Right. And so, and you had
But
Ward
we have class
Connerly.
problems, but the United States has class problems if we don't collect data on class. I mean, that, you know,
But,
it's
no,
not,
but the Census Bureau does through the American Community Survey. So let's not just focus on the decennial. For all sorts of reasons, there was a long form that was taken out, and there was a short form, and this was part of those. I would argue
but the
that
public
when you,
discourse is not around the AC, the American Community Survey.
Yeah, yeah.
no, but it doesn't matter. No, but there's a ton there. But
The ton
That-
of
that's-
data, but it's not the public, you know, you don't see dozens of headlines.
so maybe
The
that's
Community Survey
right.
of 2017 tells us.
But there is, when you talk about home ownership data, when you talk about education data, poverty data, all of that, right? But the thing I would say is this, lest anyone think, and I think, let's not fall into the trap of Shelby v. Holder, to somehow think that we live in a post-racial society. What we're seeing, no, wait, hold on, let me just finish, Jennifer. So, and I don't know if this is where Ken Pruitt is going, but if somehow we think that we are beyond the sin of race and all the pernicious effects of race, we are nowhere close to even being towards the beginning of the end, right? And so it's not just about slavery, it's about Jim Crow. When you look at all of the redlining data, I mean, you just do the pre and post, and it's remarkable how decades later, you still see patterns. And a lot of that is about Black people, but in parts of the Southwest, it's about Latinos as well. And we have to collect this data to then solve it. Just saying, let's stop collecting the data, and somehow that is going to be the key driver that gets us to a society where there's no material connection between one's race and these outcomes, I think is very fanciful. I think there are other ways we get there.
Who among
I
us
just
is
want to
saying?
clarify something. Ken Pruitt
Yeah.
did not say stop collecting data about race. He was saying that we were not paying attention because we gave such prominence to race exclusively. We were not paying attention to another really critical dimension of inequality. I don't know. That to me doesn't sound so terrible.
Yeah, just to throw something in quickly.
Sure, and let's make this the last
we gotta
word,
stop.
Rodney.
Okay, one of the slides that I ran right through and whatever is I do think that, you know, we do often still think of these things, and very understandably so, in black and white. But I think the presence of Latinos and Asians and so on actually in certain ways have kind of a modulating impact. That on the one hand, it may mean some concerns are ignored, others are given attention, others too much attention. But the fact that we now have these four prominent groups, at least four, there could be 5 or 6, depending on how one wants to count. There is kind of a, I don't want to use the phrase cross-cutting cleavages, but there is something going on there that does kind of moderate or modify things. But in the data that I look at on the states, it's still black and white at the end, you know, at the two ends of a spectrum. And Latinos and Asians are kind of in the middle somewhere on this dimension or that dimension or that dimension. And I think that has important implications. I'm not sure they're all for the better, but they're there. I'll stop.
Okay.
That's a really great last word, Rodney. So my tremendous thanks to all the panelists, to Jack Citrin and the Citrin Center, to Eva and Graychelle for all their help organizing it. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you all. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.